Welcome to today's Global Connections television program. I'm Bill Miller. The main purpose of this show is to promote a discussion of major international issues such as war and peace, economic and social development, climate change, and human rights that impact people worldwide. New knowledge will inspire, involve, and motivate all of us to better deal with these challenges and to help create a better world. Today's program is going to focus on various leaders such as Fidel Castro, Angela Merkel, Bill Clinton, and many others, and talk about the factors that go into helping them make up their minds about decision making. That's the important thing. We will be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're going to look at how personality and political leadership tie into the decision-making process of key leaders that we know today and some who were with us not too many years ago. My guest today is an expert on these leaders and this process. My guest today is Dr. Gene Krasno. Dr. Gene Krasno is an author and also a tenured lecturer with the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership at the City College of New York. Dr. Krasno teaches courses on the United Nations and international law at Yale and also at Columbia University. Dr. Gene Krasno, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
In that introduction, I was doing my own decision making,
yes,
trying
right.
to figure out where we're going to go with this. But anyway, I appreciate you being with me today. And you have, in the past, you've authored and co-edited several really interesting books. And you just recently came out with another one. And let me pull this up so our viewers can see it. It's Personality, Political Leadership, and Decision Making, A Global Perspective. How did you decide to write this book? Why did you decide to write it? And what's the main thrust of the book?
Well, actually, I did my doctoral dissertation in the field of political psychology because I became very interested in how people made decisions, chose different policies over other policies. In that case, I was looking at nuclear issues, why a country would decide to have a nuclear weapon or not. But in doing that, I began then to teach courses on political leadership and decision making. And through that process of teaching the course several different times at City College and at Yale, I began to develop a theory of a way to look at that and to look at different personalities. So that's how the book came about.
Very good. And now you've selected 19 leaders, and we won't have time to get into all 19
right.
of them, but there really is a real cross-section
yes.
of political philosophies, areas of the world, geographical
yes.
areas, political persuasions. And let's just start with one. We'll start with sort of the guy who brought the world together for 10 years, or attempted to, with the United Nations, and that's Kofi Annan. He was the 7th Secretary General
right.
of the United Nations. Ban Ki-moon is currently the 8th, and they'll be selecting a new Secretary General. Talk a little bit about Kofi Annan, his personality and his political leadership, and how that tied into decision making.
Well, right, and as you may know, I was asked to put together Kofi Annan's papers, and I then did publish the collected set of Kofi Annan's papers. And in doing that and reading everything that he had done, and I became very fascinated with him as a person and the kinds of decisions that he had made. And so I decided to follow through on that more fully. And I went to Ghana for a month and had the opportunity of meeting his family members, learning more about the chieftaincy system in Ghana because he grew up in that system. And I had been told that the way he was trained as he was growing up was to be like a chief. And then, of course, he ended up being chief of the UN. So I wanted to understand a little bit more how that developed and how that shaped his personality.
And you mentioned the collected papers of Kofi Annan, and this is one of 4
There's
bound,
five actually
five
altogether.
bound volumes. Okay, so you've our viewers now, we've talked about 2 books already in a matter of 3.5 minutes, but they can Google these books,
Yes.
or you can go to Amazon.com or
Sure.
any other book distributor
Yeah.
and get more information on both of them. Let's talk about Kofi Annan. He was a very interesting person. A lot of people said he was a secretary and a general at the United Nations. what traits did he have that tied in, let's say, his personality, political leadership, that tied into his decision-making processes? And is there one major issue he dealt with? I know he dealt with many, but one that comes to mind that would be an example of how this worked?
Right. Well, I think one of the major characteristics that he had was his ability to listen. He could listen to people for a long period of time and not interrupt them. I, unfortunately, don't have that skill. But, and I mentioned that to someone at some point. It's amazing how he will listen and he remembers everything. And they said to me, well, that's a skill that you develop as a chief. You must do that because you have to find a solution. You have to seek reconciliation within your community. And he watched his father, and his father was very close friends with the Akan king, and they came to their house all the time, and he watched that happen. Then he also was extremely, and is, open-minded. So willing not only to understand his own position, but be open-minded to find out, well, why does another person have a different position, and to learn about that. And so his ability to reach out to everyone was a great skill that he brought to being Secretary General. And then the way he saw his role once he achieved becoming Secretary General was to use his position to bring the attention to the world of problems that people were facing: poverty, discrimination, crisis. He wanted the UN to think about humanitarian intervention, which then evolved into the concept of responsibility to protect. So this is, the kind of thing that he brought to the office, but it came from a deeper personality within himself.
And of course, Kofi Annan was very involved in setting up the Millennium Development Goals.
Absolutely.
To reduce abject poverty, to promote universal primary school education, and do 8 other very quantifiable, laudable goals.
Yeah.
He also mentioned, I remember watching an interview with him on Charlie Rose several years ago, and he said his greatest frustration was not being able to stop the invasion of Iraq, which he considered illegal, and many scholars and many international lawyers and domestic lawyers considered an illegal invasion.
Yeah.
How did that play into this, that he was not able to do it, that the invasion was launched to find these non-existent weapons of mass destruction?
Right.
And today, that action basically started the destabilization. People talk about the Arab Spring, but that really started the destabilization. The creation of ISIS came directly out of that invasion. But how did he deal with that in his decision-making process?
Well, the Secretary General has a very difficult role to play because they have to be impartial with the member states. They can't take sides with this member state or that member state. And yet they have to uphold the charter. And he got himself caught right in the middle because you had a major power that was determined that they were going to go into Iraq and use force. And a Secretary General doesn't have a military, doesn't have a budget, really is the servant of the member states. And so there wasn't anything in his power that he could do to stop it, except to bring up the issue that it wasn't in alignment with the UN Charter. And he kept trying to say that, and then finally he got pushed into saying it was illegal, and then, people were not happy with him saying that.
True. Well, let's move into some of the other players.
Yes,
We've got 18 more to go in a very
right.
short time frame.
Yeah.
Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, a very prominent player in the European Union and in other parts of the world too, I guess, but certainly in Europe. How does your book and how do your factors, your personality traits, the political persuasions, whatever, tie into how Angela Merkel is dealing with the world today? And is there a decision she's made recently that you would like to focus on?
Well, with Angela Merkel, one thing I would like to say about the book is that we have a wide range of people with all different personalities, ranging from extreme authoritarianism within non-democratic states, all the way to very open-minded people like Kofi Annan. And Angela Merkel is one who is very open-minded. She was born in West Germany, in Hamburg. No, she was born in West Germany.
Oh, she was born in West Germany. Was she?
Hamburg, yes.
Oh,
and
my mistake. I apologize.
Her father was a pastor, and he felt the need to go into East Germany and live there in order to keep the Christian faith alive in a communist country. And so he moved his whole family there when she was a baby. So she was born in Hamburg, but she actually grew up in East Germany. And within that structure, her father had to keep balance between the church, which was not allowed, and living within a very strict authoritarian society. And so she saw him and their whole family in this double life all the time, where they had to see this side and also see that side in order to survive. And so she grew up with that kind of training. And so today, what is really wonderful to watch her is that she can work with opposition leaders as well as people within her own party and search for a peaceful solution and reconcile all different sides. And today we see her trying to bring the European Union together on the issues of the refugees, and just prior to that, keeping the European Union together around the euro because of the defaulting that was happening. And so I think that her growing up with these kinds of skills what enabled her to be able to keep thinking about reconciliation.
Now, we're talking about personalities, we're talking about political persuasion and that type of thing, personal philosophy. Did you have, we couldn't go through it all, but did you have a matrix? I'm sure you have a detailed matrix of how you looked at these leaders. Is that correct?
Yes. So in the book, we spell that out. And our premise in the book is that, contrary to realist theory, states don't make decisions. People make decisions. And the personality of the people who are making those decisions is important. How they see the world, how they see power, how they see their ability to work with people, to network, to be sociable. All of that is important. And then we also take another step back, saying how we look at how that particular personality develops over time.
And this is something that is really so critical that we need to focus upon. So let's think about one more person before we go to the mid-show ID. Fidel Castro. We've read about Fidel Castro since really prior to 1959 when he came to power in Cuba. And of course we see a rapprochement right now between the United States and Cuba. There's a thawing of the relations, or the relations are improving, I should say, a thawing of the frigid conditions between the two countries. What type of role did Fidel Castro play, and how did he tie into your book?
Well, he's a complicated character, very complicated. I mean, he is an authoritarian leader, so he's in that group, that we talk about in terms of authoritarianism, the need for control, and narcissistic, the need to be the center of attention. You see that. I mean, he's older now, so he can't do that. But when you look at his childhood, he was a very violent child. and so the sense of him retaining that, he grew up that way. For just as a simple example, well, I'll give you two examples of that. His father had bought a car. Now, in the old days, it was very unusual for someone in Cuba to have a car. And Fidel, I think, was only like 9 years old. And he said, I want to drive the car. And his father said, no, you're too young, you can't drive the car. He said, if you don't let me drive the car, I'm going to set it on fire. So he got to drive the car. Okay. So you can see, even at a very young age, he had a violent nature.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately financed, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections Television are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Our viewers are invited to check out the website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous shows. If you're interested in distributing our shows through PBS, community access television, educational institutions, a website, or any other media outlet, please go to our website for more information. Global Connections Television is provided as a public service, free of charge, at no cost. Today we're looking at the situation where we have a decision-making process for various leaders around the world, and what are some of the various factors that go into them making these decisions. My guest today is an expert because she's just written a book on it. My guest today is Dr. Jean Krasno. Dr. Krasno recently authored a new book called Personality, Political Leadership, and Decision-Making, A Global Perspective. Jean, we're talking about, well, we're in the Latin American area right now. We may as well drop into Argentina and talk about Eva Perón. Now, this is going back into the 50s, I guess, really the 40s, and into the 50s. Juan Domingo Perón was the president of Argentina for many years. His wife, Eva Perón, was a very prominent personality. She had her own following to a large degree.
Absolutely.
Who was Eva Perón, and why did you pick her, and what did she do that stood out?
Well, she didn't hold public office, but in a sense, she created her own public life as the wife of the president. And she knew that she had that focus, that the people loved her. And because she had grown up in really abject poverty, she had tremendous sympathy for people who were poor, orphaned children. And so she used her position to create the Eva Perón Foundation, and through that foundation she set up schools for orphan children, she set up hospitals, she took care of the elderly, and she was absolutely dedicated to doing that. But she was very glamorous. She started out in theater, and she was in radio, and that is actually how she met Juan Perón, and she helped his candidacy by talking about him on the radio and promoting him on the radio. And so she was asked at one point, well, you're trying to help the poor. Why do you dress so glamorously? And she said, the poor don't want somebody running around in rags. They want me to look good because they want to aspire to what I have been able to achieve in my life. And they need me to look this way. And I think she was absolutely right. That was her culture, and she understood it.
And as I recall, she died of cancer at a fairly early age, in her early 30s or something like that.
Well, she worked very hard. She was compulsive about her work, and she would often just have a couple of hours of sleep each night. And she just drove herself so much that she wore herself out. But by that time, she was already thinking about running for vice president, because in Argentina at that time, you could run separately. And she created her own political party, but then she died before she was able to do that.
And one of the most prominent and most outstanding leaders, political leaders, was Nelson Mandela. He was the first president of the post-apartheid era in South Africa. And of course, a lot of people believe that he was probably the only person who could bring that country together because of so many of the divisions that existed, and to reconcile the years of hatred and the apartheid period. Why did you pick Nelson Mandela, and what did he do that was outstanding?
Well, it's very interesting because the other point that we bring out in the development of personality is not only your early years, but things that happen to you later on as adults, which can be traumatic. Well, he spent, 25, 26 years in jail. And then he used that time to reflect. What do I want for my country? And he realized through that time that what he wanted for his country is for all the people to be able to come together. Now, that is not completely unusual because, like Kofi Annan, he grew up in a chieftaincy structure. And his parents, I think that the father died. And so at age 12, he went to live with an uncle, and the uncle was a paramount chief. That means one of the higher chiefs. You have a village chief, and then over several villages, you have a paramount chief. And so he lived and grew up and was raised with the paramount chief, which was the same kind of structure. You must always look for reconciliation. You have to keep your community together. And so, even though he had been a rebel fighter in the ANC prior to going to jail, that part of his personality came out, and he used that. And when he came out, then that was what he wanted to do for his country, to keep everybody together.
Now we're talking about political leaders, and we're doing it very quickly.
We're doing it
Apologies for
quickly.
that. Another one of the most interesting political leaders was Saddam Hussein. We talked about
Yes.
Iraq a little earlier.
Oh, right.
How did you decide to focus on, or why did you decide to focus on Saddam?
Well, we basically had to, include Saddam Hussein. I mean, what we wanted to do in this book is, the analysis of personality isn't new, but most of them had been done on American men. And so we wanted women, we wanted people around the world from every continent, and that was why we have the diversity. But with Saddam also, we wanted to look at extreme authoritarian leader and look at his childhood. And his childhood was terrible. When his mom became pregnant with him, she tried to kill herself a few times. And she actually said, "I'm carrying the devil." But she didn't succeed in killing herself. When the baby was born, she didn't want to take care of him, and she gave him to her brother, his uncle. And he raised Saddam for several years, and then the uncle was put in jail. And so Saddam had to come back and live with his mother, and by that time there was a stepfather who beat him. Finally, the uncle came out of jail. He went back to live with the uncle, and the uncle trained him to be an assassin. And that was their goal, because they wanted to remove the government.
So that was early training.
Early training.
Early training.
Early training.
Exactly. Well, we're talking about these leaders, and there's so many more that we could talk about. But before we run out of time, I do want to focus a little bit on the Secretary General of the United Nations. We talked about Kofi Annan a few minutes ago, the seventh Secretary General of the United Nations.
Right.
Ban Ki-moon is concluding his term at the end of this year. There'll be a new Secretary General of the United Nations. Trygve, the first Secretary General of the United Nations, once said that to Dag Hammarskjöld, the second one, that being Secretary General is, quote, the most difficult job in the world, unquote, or something to that effect.
Yes, absolutely.
Is it the most difficult job in the world?
It is. It's very difficult, because you're sitting at the top of a universal organization. So you're considered like the world leader, but you have no power. You don't have an army, as I said before. You don't have a budget. You have a few little slush funds that you can do small things with. But otherwise, you really don't have any authority. But the one quality that you do have, because you are the symbol of the UN, is to use that as a bully pulpit. And that's what Kofi Annan did. He really saw, this is my chance to promote human rights, to promote humanitarian intervention, to fight poverty. So, that is how he used the office. But every Secretary General looks at the office in a different way. Some say, no, I prefer to stay behind the scenes and mediate and maintain the confidentiality of the member states. So I don't want to be such a public figure. So it isn't like you have to do one or the other, but everybody has a different role. So now we're coming up on the election of the next Secretary General, and I have been leading a campaign to get a woman elected Secretary General this time. I mean, we've had 8 now in 70 years, and we have not had a woman, and so we really feel it's strongly that it's time.
There's quite a groundswell, as I understand it, out there. A lot of folks, many of the member states of the UN and people outside the UN. What would be some of the advantages of having a female?
Well, I think that's a very good question. Other than it's fair,
Right.
and it's equity.
And they're 51% of the population.
Right, and they're 51% of the population. But also, when you look around the world right now at all the crises that we're facing, with 60 million refugees, earthquakes, floods, climate change, all of these issues, women are definitely suffering from this. They become the focal point in many ways, because they have children, they have parents, they have elderly parents, other family members, and they're fleeing with all of these people. And when you understand how many refugees are fleeing into Europe, and a certain percentage of those women are going to be pregnant, they're giving birth while they're fleeing with no help. And so we really strongly feel that a woman at the top as Secretary General will give these women a voice. If you say, well, we want a Secretary General from this region or that region, then the member states must feel that they'll represent the interests of that region. Well, then why are we ignoring the interests of women that make up 51% of the population of the world, and they're all over the world? You know, so that's, you know, part of our argument.
It's very factual, and also, as you mentioned about the Secretary General, it is an extremely important position because there is no other institution like the UN that brings 193 countries of the world together. And many UN observers feel that Ban Ki-moon, had it not been for him quietly pushing, sometimes not so quietly, pushing climate change, that we would not be at the point we are today where they just signed a major climate change agreement. So the role of the Secretary General is absolutely critical. But Dr. Jean Krasno, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, this was fun.
Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed today's program. Please join us again for the next episode of Global Connections Television. I'm Bill Miller. Thanks for watching.